And it's my privilege to introduce you to Zick Landscape Kyle Zick, I'm sorry, I got the Z, there's no light here. Kyle Zick Landscape Architecture, KZLA, is a boutique landscape architecture firm based in Boston. I'm now going to hand it over to Kyle, who is the principal, and I'd ask you to join me with welcoming his team to the theater. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, so much. I appreciate everyone being here today and having such commitment to the project, sitting through all of the presentations, and that shows just so much passion and ownership for this important landscape. So hopefully we'll draw from that a little bit and show you a little bit about our experience and our qualifications and our thoughts on the lakes, and give you a sense of what we could add to the project that all of you could benefit from. Also, I want to introduce our team, because it's not just me doing this project or proposing to do this project. I'll let everyone introduce themselves, actually.
I'm Angela Bolger, I'm with HDR.
I'm Kevin Harris Architect.
Daryl Wiggins with Lincoln Builders.
All right, and we'll let all of them speak more about their particular discipline as we go along. I want to spend a little bit of time on this first image, because this is my only chance to make this first impression. And I very deliberately wanted to talk about your project right from the get-go. So this is a photo montage we created of a part of the lake that you know, but you may not recognize it from here. On the right would be Dalrymple Drive with University Lake on the left. And we're suggesting some of the different issues and some of the resolutions to those issues that we could offer as part of our proposal. So I think, obviously, the health of the lake is the issue that we're all concerned about. And there are many, many contributors to the health of the lake, or the poor health of the lake. And the reason that we talk about sedimentation and dredging every 20 or 30 years in Baton Rouge. So we feel like we have to look at the watershed in general, but particularly the perimeter roads, Dalrymple Drive. You get a heavy storm and all of the oil and gas and sediment from that road runs right into the lake. So how can we capture that water before that happens? One, if there's existing drainage structures, or if we would add new, like shown here in the lower right, we would have oil and gas separators on those drainage structures here. And we'd also have sumps to trap the sediment, again, so we have an opportunity to clean that from the land before it gets into the lake. Then anything that would run off the road would go into created wetlands. We would use the spoil from the dredging process and have it around the perimeter of the lake, one, to trap that hot water that comes off the pavement that has the first flush, that sediment and pollution, and be treated in this wetland. Creating that land also gives us a chance to get those joggers, runners, and bikers off the road shoulder here and put them on a separate path that is much safer and in a park-like environment instead of being part of the highway. And then this wetland also creates a habitat for amphibians, reptiles, and shorebirds, and that people would have close exposure to those. The other advantage is that the sediment that gets trapped here can be removed by an excavator on land. You don't need a barge, you don't need to drain the pond or the lake, you can do it from right here, so that hopefully we can break that cycle of dredging every 20 or 30 years. We also want to heighten the experience for the park user so that there is a park-like environment here. There's trees planted between traffic and the paths, the multimodal paths, but also for scenic value, but also for habitat, we have planting in the water or around the shoreline. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my firm. I'm a small firm in Boston, very deliberately a small firm. 4 years ago, I left a large firm to start my own because I thought a small firm can deliver a higher quality product. And the reason that's true is because I will work on your project. I don't just show up to an interview and then disappear. I recently finished a large master plan project like this. I billed half of my hours last year to that project. My whole office, all 5 of us, worked on that master plan. And the examples I'll show you here are projects I worked on, not something that someone else in the office worked on. And this may seem like an obvious thing, but we're a firm that listens. If you were involved with the city park process at all, which I had worked on, you know that we came in with a fairly contentious environment, but we listened to all the different issues that were some were competing. And we know that we're going to have the same issues or competing issues for this project as well. So early on in the design stage, we don't come in with design solutions. We come in with just good listening ears to make sure we understand that the private landowners have different issues from the public landowners or from the joggers. We are adept at complex master plans. We're just on the heels of finishing one in Boston, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. And we've been recognized nationally and locally for our work with design awards. And I do want to stress also that our firm focuses on passive recreation design. We don't design new towns in China or resorts in Florida and then say we can do passive recreation design. So that Emerald Necklace project I talked about, which is the large master plan in Boston, it's a nationally significant historic landscape. It's 1,100 acres, follows the watercourse of the Muddy River, designed by the father of landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted, in 1880. We were selected by the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, which is a nonprofit, to embark on a new master plan for their urban forest. What's similar to your project is that, one, it's owned by multiple landowners. We have the state of Massachusetts, the city of Boston, and the town of Brookline that are landowners, and a nonprofit that is heading up the project. So we understand how to work in terms of politics, but also listening to different constituents and also different needs of different landowners. Early on, the project was data-driven because it was a tree inventory and conditions assessment. We wanted to make sure that data, which can be a little dry, was palatable and understandable by the community. So we used graphically intensive information so that people could readily understand it, and we hit the streets and made sure that we met with every community group that wanted to hear us so they could understand the importance of this project. And now if you ask the people who have come to the meetings why soil is important for the Emerald Necklace, they can explain it as well as I can. Another project that is very similar, although a different scale, is Powers Farm in Randolph, Massachusetts. It's a 20-acre site with a 6-acre pond. It's a little hard to recognize the pond, but it's this green thing in the middle. It averages 2 feet deep, 6 feet at its deepest, 18 inches at its shallowest, and you could almost walk across the water lilies. Similar to you, they wanted to expand water-based recreation, improve fish habitat, the water quality, the dissolved oxygen levels. So we studied it carefully. Now, they very early on decided they did not want to dredge. So we looked at hydro-raking and using selective herbicides to control the vegetation in portions of the lake, not all of it. And now we're implementing 2 phases of this project. It was recognized by the Boston Society of Landscape Architects for a planning award last year. I want to talk about City Park a little bit as well. While with another firm, back in 2004 to 2008, Bill Taylor and I, who was also on this project, worked on updating the master plan, and that master plan needed some tweaks because we felt like there were some very important aspects of the master plan that didn't highlight what's really special about City Park. As an example, at Picnic Hill here, there was a parking lot proposed, and I can't imagine where generally Louisiana is flat and topography is kind of special that you'd want to park cars on a high point. So we said, no, what needs to be there is the playground, an open space, and then you can park down the hill. The other part of City Park is that I think generally Dalrymple Drive was a dividing line. There were 2 parts to the park, and now if you go to the park, there is no dividing line because we've connected Old South to City Park and also the Lakeshore area to City Park as well, where people routinely go to all parts of the park. And I think what we really wanted to work on was to highlight what's really special. Steel Burden planted those live oak trees, and they're his legacy, but now they're a fantastic place to enjoy the park itself when the sun is out or when the sun is down. And we wanted to take even the tiniest little details, like the edging of the concrete, and use those live oak acorns to stamp the concrete. So again, it's unique to City Park and Baton Rouge. And that the signage has that same theme kind of woven throughout it. So I wanted to, one, it's not all about me, because even though we have a very strong team back in Boston, we have an incredible team to support us. And as I mentioned, some of them are here today, HDR, Kevin Harris, and Lincoln Builders. Others I will talk about as well who are not here today. I will let Angela come up and talk a little bit about HDR. She has very broad shoulders today because she's representing a firm that is covering the disciplines of ecology, civil engineering, transportation engineering, also have experts in acoustical engineering and highway sound. So I'll let Angela talk a little bit about HDR in general.
Thank you, Kyle. As Kyle mentioned, I'm Angela Boldrin with HDR. I'm based out of Lafayette. Just a little bit about HDR. It is a big firm. There's about 8,000 employees worldwide, over 200 offices. We have a local presence in Louisiana, and most of the disciplines that will be providing support to this team are based out of Lafayette, New Orleans, and Metairie. The advantage, I think, to having a big firm like HDR on the team is if specialty technical issues do come up, it's very, very likely that we will have the ability to provide someone with that expertise to the team if needed. Just a little bit about some of the projects we've worked on. They're shown here. A representative similar to this, the San Antonio River Reach Museum, was out of Texas, and it was a two-phase project that incorporated the traditional river walk portion, revamping that, and then further upstream, doing a little bit more like what we're proposing here and using the natural system to provide recreational use habitat for wildlife and using natural components of a system to improve water quality downstream. The Lake Pontchartrain Shoreline Protection and Habitat Restoration Project was also designed out of our Lafayette office. And just so you know, within Louisiana, we do have about 25 staff here. We're comprised of coastal engineers, civil engineers, specializing in stormwater and water management, the ecology team, cultural resources. We've got construction management and CAD design specialists. So that covers HDR for now.
Thank you. Kevin Harris, I think, is well known to all of you, but I think if he could add a few things in terms of your expertise and your experience.
Yes, I'm Kevin Harris. I have an architectural firm in Baton Rouge. I grew up here. I jog around the lakes. I would like to say every day, but not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week. These are some projects that I've worked with Kyle in the past on the tennis center at LSU, at City Park, and on the City Park project. And we took what was really just a few bathrooms and then made a tennis center out of it, and by using space and space between the 2 buildings. We've renovated buildings downtown. There's one on the Shell Oil building, which is Cordoba Square. It was the original Shell Oil building in Baton Rouge. However, when my client got it, it was covered in wood shake shingles and plywood covered with rocks. So we were able to restore it, keep it historic, and then bring it back into commerce. The bulk of my work, as you can see in the bottom right picture, is residential in Baton Rouge. And the reason I focused on residential is most of the work I do is culturally based. It's very important to me that every building, be it commercial, be it a restaurant, be it a residence, has cultural expressions to it, and expressions that mean things. So when I do a house, it's forever. And so when I do have a commercial building, hopefully it is forever as well. Anyway, I have had a good time working with Kyle in the past and look forward to hopefully working with him in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And then Daryl will talk a little bit about Lincoln Builders and what they can bring to the project.
Daryl Williams. I'm also local to Baton Rouge. We, as Lincoln Builders, we're going to be responsible with working with Kyle and his firm to establish the budget. We will be working closely with them throughout the entire design phase so that we know where we stand dollar-wise. As far as tied to the team, we were the low bidder for the City Park project, which was a great project for us. Another project that we did just recently, we were selected as the contractor for the LSU Arboretum, which is the first lead project, I believe, for LSU at this time, and it was recently completed. A very successful project. Had some budgeting issues in the beginning. We worked with them, value engineered the job, and made it a very successful job. So again, we're going to be working with the team, helping establish budgets. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. So in terms of some of our other team members, we do have some team members which I think are unique to this proposal. We have Orca out of Florida who specialize in visitor studies, visitor assessment, and also carrying capacity. This is an example project I worked on them with in Cades Cove. It's part of Smoky Mountains National Park. it's illustrating as part of a survey to visitors what different levels of visitation could look like, and then people would respond either favorably or not favorably. And this is part of thinking about carrying capacity, because we're all going to have great ideas on how to develop the lakes, but we want to make sure we don't do too much and we ruin the place itself. Then we also have Roel Barassi for wayfinding and signage design, who I've worked with over the past 20 years. And then we have Tool Design Group, who are nationally recognized as experts in bicycle and pedestrian planning. They wrote the book that everyone refers to for the AASHTO Guide for Bicycle Development, or Development of Bicycle Facilities. And they've also written the Louisiana Statewide Bicycle and Pedestrian Master Plan. Over the past 4 years, I have images of 6 master plans here. I've worked on a number that I feel like I have some lessons learned. One, of course, a master plan has to be visionary and inspirational for people to really feel ownership and get behind it, but they also have to be flexible, because master plans do get applied over a number of years, and even over the course of the design, they tend to take different courses that we're not fully understanding right now. The Emerald Necklace and the Powers Farm project both, I added consultants midway through the project as new needs came up that weren't even spelled out in the RFP. So for us to be able to be flexible and adapt to those things is important. To reinforce what Daryl said, we also need to be realistic, because as we develop these visions that we're all going to love and want to see implemented, we want real, hard financial backing behind it in terms of cost estimates. That's why we're not saying we're going to do the cost estimating in-house. We want a firm that actually builds things to come up with real numbers that we can then go out to funding sources and say, yes, this is the amount that we really need to do this. Now, as part of the public engagement project, I also feel like it's an educational opportunity. I mentioned earlier, as part of the Emerald Necklace, that a lot of people know a lot more about soils and can then tell their neighbors because of what we've told them along the way. And I think we need to do the same here for the lakes in terms of why it's important and what we need to do and how things will need to change in terms of management of the landscape, but also how it's used. Any decision we make at the lakes is not an easy one, because there are so many things that are interrelated. We may decide that for wildlife value, we want to create a shoreline with a certain profile, but we have to then weigh that against the impact to a jogger or a bicyclist, or what it means to water quality or the landscape. So all these decisions will be weighed in that way. In terms of the overall park experience, there's a lot of things to consider. One, I think there are a lot of areas around the lakes now that have those fantastic park-like qualities, but there are many, contrasting with that, that feel like you're on the edge of a highway. We also have to remember this is a cultural landscape. You know, it's evolved quite a bit since the 1930s when it changed from a cypress tupelo swamp, and that radical changes need to be considered and thought through. Or do we just highlight, like we did in City Park, what's really special and improve what isn't as good? In terms of ecology, Angela's going to talk a little bit more about this, but I think as a lead-in to what she's going to say, I think too often what I'm finding with the lakes is that engineering approaches have been applied to what really shouldn't be engineering approaches. That's why I'm saying we need green approaches, not gray solutions here. If there's an unstable bank out here, it's been reinforced with broken concrete. If there's a drainage problem, have it flow into the lakes. If we need to have separation, but so if someone doesn't fall in the lake, we use a highway detail. We need to think of this as a park and as a natural system. So Angela will talk more about it as a natural system in the ecology.
Thank you, Kyle. I think what we'd like to do with this is consider approaches or alternatives that can use the natural system to improve the issues, to address the issues that the lakes are facing. The largest one, water quality, everybody's aware of. There are things that can be done rather than putting in hardscapes that use the natural systems to address those issues, and also can provide benefits to other resources and other lake users. Thank you. For example, planting successional vegetation, starting with native species that are also aesthetically pleasing, such as sedges and even some iris, cattails, that kind of thing, where appropriate, and transitioning into buttonbush and water willow, and then incorporating trees to provide shade and other habitat structure that transition upland, to starting with cypress and going into water oaks and live oaks and even some magnolias, that kind of thing. Those species are not only going to provide the benefit needed to address some of the water quality issues, but also provide aesthetics for the recreational users of the lake and those that live around the lake. This just provides a list of some of the species that have been noted in previous surveys. The lakes have been studied, being where they are near the university. Lots and lots of research has been done. I think taking that research and building on it, determining what types of habitat need to be incorporated into the design to accommodate these species. For example, some of the bird species need shallow water, such as the egrets. Others need the deep water. Some of the fish would benefit from habitat along the shoreline, not only providing useful nursery and feeding areas, but it could address some dissolved oxygen issues with photosynthesis from the plants rather than having hardscape features.
So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the users. First, with water-based recreation. Here's a list of some of the potential users, although not all of these are possible right now. Kevin told me that the LSU had a sailing club at one point, but they had to stop because the center boards kept hitting the cypress stumps. And I know there's a shallow force main as well that cuts across the lake. In the past dredging, I believe in the 80s, it wasn't dredged around the perimeter of the lake particularly or on purpose to try to discourage swimming because of the poor water quality. So as we go forward, we have to think about what uses do we want to encourage in the water and how programmatically the water can accommodate that. On the land, it's no different. I mean, you all know how many different users are out there, and some of them are definitely conflicting, particularly with that large car on the bottom of the slide. So we have to figure out a way to separate these users, scale the widths and sizes of the paths appropriately, and also make sure the design speeds for the cars, but also for bikes, are appropriate. Because in some cases, it's a commuter bike who are trying to get from point A to point B very quickly. Others are just out for a nice leisurely ride. The I-10 environment is a unique one, and today, unique not in a good way. Because when you're underneath the bridge, you feel like you're in a tin can. You know, it's 90 decibels of road noise rumbling overhead, debris is raining down, and if you were there in the rain, you'd be covered in stormwater. And then that splashes on the concrete and erodes the bank going into the lake. There are plenty of examples out there of design opportunities under these bridges. Bill Taylor and I have worked on one in South Portland and Portland, Maine, where we've done that to highlight the flow of stormwater off of the bridge. There are others that use light or sculpture or art opportunities. And in terms of trying to direct the noise or deaden the noise, HDR does have folks who are very well known in terms of acoustical engineering. And Bill Taylor, who I mentioned, who's consulting on the project, has worked on more than 50 bridges, probably more than any landscape architect that I know. Signage is something we have a specialized consultant for. I'm highlighting signs at City Park that I was involved with directly. And I think the message that I want to get across is that signage does not have one answer. We have to design signage, one, to be very clear for all different types of users. That's for someone in a car, but also the bicyclist and pedestrian. And I think there's a layer of information that is missing around the lakes now, which is interpretive information. The lakes have a long history, and I think that's important to tell, but also the ecology is important just to reinforce that message so people further understand that this is a fragile landscape and an ecosystem. We did that at City Park, not in overt ways. This image of steel burden is a very small image at the bottom of one of the light columns, one of the gateways. So they're almost discoveries. They don't have to be something that's large and kind of cause sign pollution. I mentioned the evolution of the lakes, and there's certainly been quite a long story here, evolving from the Cypress Tupelo swamp to when it was initially dredged toward today. I've read studies on the lakes and the sedimentation from the 50s and 70s and 80s and then more current things. And as I said earlier, we have to break this cycle of dredging every so often. And I think there are ways that we can capture that sediment before it gets to the center of the lake or throughout the lake where it's more difficult to remove. The studies that GEC has done with the Army Corps show the challenges with the water depth that certainly are concerns for the water quality, the temperature, and dissolved oxygen. And I think as we go forward, we have to ultimately decide where do we want deeper water and where shallow water makes sense. And the cypress swamps and the stumps are certainly an obstacle to that, and will have a lot to do with how we actually perform the dredging. This was a plan that GEC had prepared as part of the Army Corps study, the green around the outside being made land with the spoil. And I find this interesting, one, because the lake gets that much smaller, but two, that there are a number of mounds proposed, which in Baton Rouge is an anomaly from a landscape perspective. In City Park, topography is expected. But around here, I wonder if those mounds are a good idea. And instead, kind of that opening image I had, it was more of depressions around the edge of the lake to capture water versus trying to dispose of spoil. So I think there are ways for us to creatively think about that. Public engagement is something I do want to focus on, and it's been great fun following the social media comments on the lakes over the course of the past few weeks, and how diametrically opposed some of the comments are. Someone may say, we need to plant more trees, and someone says, well, don't block my view. And that we need more wetlands for habitat, but I don't want mosquitoes. And how are we going to stop mosquitoes in Louisiana? And others saying we need islands for habitat, but again, don't block my view. So ultimately, this falls on my shoulders if I were selected in our team to really educate people and to have us all in one room to kind of talk these things through. We're not always going to agree, but I at least want us to all understand the other viewpoint so that we can have that common ground. I try to make these things easy for you, so I've told you why you need to select our firm. Ultimately, even though we are a small firm, and I don't say that in an apologetic way, I think it's a strong suit. We're experienced in this kind of work, passive recreation, master plans that are complex, and that we're a creative team. We're not just going to give you more of the same. You've seen that on what's been done with City Park and trying to highlight what's special about that place. We're thoughtful and engaged with the community. We also use technology to our advantage, not to scare people, but to hopefully make things more transparent and available. On the Emerald Necklace project, all of the data we gathered, we made available on a website. Even though it was in GIS, which is not available to everyone, it's readily available to the public so they can have all of that information. And we're collaborative. I know that seems a little obvious, but we really want to work with the community and the stakeholders very carefully. And the last thing I say there is that we are low maintenance, and it seems like a funny thing to end this with, but we do not come here with a design ego, with things that we're trying to force on you, or design solutions we're hoping to implement somewhere if someone let us do it. We want to come up with context-derived solutions that are right for Baton Rouge and right for the lakes. And you won't have to deal with a designer ego that you feel is unapproachable. My small firm and our team will be made available, and we will give you everything we have because we're passionate about the work we do. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
We'll move into Q&A.
So let's expand, if you would, on your last point. You're a small firm. You didn't apologize for it. In one of the earlier examples, you talked about having to bring in additional firms to deal with some specific issues on a project. Let's talk about your size and the scope of this work and where you see you starting. You are not engineers. You are going to leave that mostly, I assume, to GEC, but let's talk about the size of your firm, the expertise you need. You truly understand the complexity of the project, and let's talk about dredging and all of those issues that are going to be a part of this thing, and how and who on your team would be doing that.
Sure. All right, so I'll start with the size of the firm and our capability to do this work. Somewhere within our committee, there is a 385-page master plan from the Emerald Necklace for you all to look at. This is we have just recently completed this in May. It took about a year to complete it, and with our 5-person firm. Now, we didn't do it alone. We had a team of arborists, historic landscape specialists, and a mapping company to do the web-based viewer that I mentioned. Now, generally, landscape architects are trained to be leaders of multidisciplinary firms, and I think everyone that will be presenting today will be kind of talking about that. I think the key is that the lead firm has led disciplines like this in similar work. So I mentioned the Powers Farm project where we've dealt with the very same issues, the shallow water, the water quality issues, and we understand how to engage the public. Now, in terms of the size of the firm, I mentioned that project there, the large project. Now, I know you have called our references, and if you were to ask them, and you probably did, was the size of the firm ever a concern, or did it cause delay, or did they not produce the quality of product? And I think they would tell you, you know, they're better than larger firms because they've just given us everything they have, because my name's on the door. I'm not leaving to go to another firm, you know, if they offer me a better offer. I mean, it means a lot to me, and I have a lot of pride in the work. Now, in terms of our ability to do the work, we're not physically drawing everything or coming up with every idea. Now, we will be the impetus behind a lot of ideas that we will then draw on our experts to help us with. You know, that first image I had of the forebay, which would treat stormwater, there's 6 team members that would be involved in how we actually design that. It's kind of the big idea that we've come up with that solves a lot of problems. But that's why we have this deep team, this deep bench, an all-star team, if you want to say, to really support us. So I think that was the first part of your question. Then in terms of having the expertise to handle the very specific needs of your project, is it dredging or ecology? Well, I think I've learned to be a prime consultant in this world, you have to know a lot about all the different disciplines. Well, I should say a little bit about each one of the disciplines to understand when to bring them in or what their issues are. So along the way, one, I do my homework to understand more about dredging. I've been through dredging on a few projects, but I make sure I understand all the different components of the project to know when I'm getting beyond my expertise and when I can draw on our team. But ultimately, I mean, you're looking for a strong leader who you can trust and you know will go to bat for you in what's going to be not smooth sailing everywhere along the way. And ultimately, these are about relationships. And you're going to hire a firm that generally you feel comfortable with staff that you feel comfortable with, and that you trust going out into the public and representing your project.
You spent quite a bit of time learning about the lakes and are very familiar with the environment. You've listed a whole bunch of the challenges that are anticipated. If you had to pick just the couple of the largest, what are the ones that give you the greatest amount of concern when looking at the project?
Well, I think it's the infrastructure in general, because you have a roadway network that has the built-in multi-use paths that are combined, and there are also segments around the perimeter of the lake that have no infrastructure for some of the recreation. To further reinforce the infrastructure idea, all the storm drains, and there's 140 storm drains that drain into the lake of all different types of condition. In the watershed in general, it gets even more difficult because you can't control all the things there, but you have private landowners who want immaculate lawns and putting all kinds of things on those lawns that drain into the lake. You have pipes for sewage systems that are from the 20s and 30s that aren't necessarily complete and solid. And when you're inundated with the intense storms that you have, the stormwater drainage system can't handle it. And then the water quality is impacted either with E. coli or sediment and that kind of thing. So before we start talking about habitat enhancement and planting and those kind of things, there's a larger infrastructure issue that is immense in its scale.
Yes, Carolyn McKnight with BREC, and I wanted to ask you a two-part question. What do you bring to this process that will wow the community and capture their imagination, and then what are some iconic things that you would bring to the lakes to set it apart from other places that we've seen around the country?
Okay. The iconic question I'll handle first. Because as I mentioned, our philosophy is that we do not have preconceived design solutions that we're going to bring and try to impose. I think there are opportunities to enhance some of the facilities that are there now and some of the I know the City Park master plan on the very southern portion talked about a boathouse at some point. Now, I actually question the validity of the location of that boathouse because I wonder if it will block the view from City Park Golf Course down to City Park Lake. Are there other locations where a boathouse, which is perfectly valid in terms of water-based recreation, is it better in another location that is not in that view shed or maybe has better access? In terms of what we would bring to this project that kind of sets us apart, I think I would go back to our example of the Emerald Necklace, where it's a complex project that has a lot of data but also science behind it, and that's not necessarily easy for the public to understand or to make it palatable. So I think it's part of our delivery style in terms of making information readily available but also easy to understand. But some of it, I mean, I have a hard time talking about myself sometimes, but it's also kind of my demeanor and the transparency in terms of how I'm able to present to the public and feel like they can trust me versus I'm trying to ram through something that I'm trying to, you know, I have an agenda. Ultimately, I feel my projects are better when I can listen to the community and the opposing viewpoints and really come up with some creative solutions which solve as many as possible. And where we can't solve them all, make sure we all understand why.
I'm Connie Betts with Louisiana DOTD. Angela mentioned experience with acoustics. I was wondering if you could give us some examples of what you have done in a park setting.
Well, I can handle this first, and then I can see if Angela wants to add to that. But we have more than one expert on our team in terms of bridge design and acoustics and those kind of elements. I mentioned Bill Taylor, who's also a landscape architect. He worked on the City Park project. And he consulted to many bridge designers, which is a little unusual that a bridge designer would ask a landscape architect to consult. But usually he was involved with aesthetic solutions for bridges. And that could be the form of the bridge, the materials, the color, the alignment, that kind of thing. But also, he's done a lot of work with acoustics. One we worked on together, which was in Portland, Maine, and it went through a residential neighborhood. And we worked a lot with, in that case, it was a landform solution, and the park helped solve the acoustic problem. At the lakes, we don't have that benefit because it's an elevated overpass. So I think we'd be looking at how the side treatments of the bridge could be treated. Of course, we don't want to affect the visibility because it is, as a driver, it's a fantastic experience. It's a gateway to Baton Rouge. You come through it's a very dense swamp, a forest, and then it opens up to these lakes. So, you know, we think about some kind of more transparent solutions. Of course, as I mentioned, everything's interrelated. You go to a transparent solution which can deflect the noise up, but the transparent solutions are a problem for birds. So it's not an easy answer. Now, on the other side, we do have in HDR's kind of deep bench, as I mentioned, they do have engineers in their Texas office which are acoustical engineers. So if we come up with ideas which we feel are aesthetically appropriate, either from the driver's perspective but also from down in the park itself, they can run calculations for us to look at the noise levels. The other thing we could look at is providing sound baffling on the underside of the bridge. It's really the metal that's causing a lot of the noise. So if there's an insulation type material that's durable, that can deaden some of that sound, I think that can really make a big difference in terms of decreasing the sound level. I don't know, Angela, if you want. Acoustical engineering is a little beyond Angela's expertise, but I don't know if you have anything to add from the HDR perspective.
Other than just saying we do have several engineers in Texas that work with TxDOT a lot on coming up with unique, innovative ways to address. I know they use the standard FHWA models, and that's about all I can say. I'm sorry, I'm a NEPA practitioner, so.
Matt Thomas, homeowner. Can you talk about how you will ensure that all members of the community will have access to the lakes, including handicapped?
Yes. So one, I think that starts with the representation of the different stakeholders and landowners. And I imagine early on in this process, you're going to create a working group that would represent a cross-section of the different stakeholders. And you want to make sure that private landowners are proportionately represented compared to LSU or the runners or whatever neighborhood or user group it may be. Now, in terms of handicap access, I mean, one, that's going to be dictated. The good thing is that you generally have flat land. The width of the paths that we'll be talking about will all accommodate accessible use, but I think the speed of bicyclists we would want to be conscious of. And oftentimes we will separate either by lane or a different path, high-speed bicycling from more of the casual strolling or what might just be an accessible multi-use path. And I think, so I mean, that's kind of a physical accommodation. I think there is also, from an outreach perspective, how we accommodate all the different stakeholders. And part of that was making sure they're represented in the working group. But I think it's also having public forums like this, but I think we want to have focus groups as well, either a neighborhood association or to talk to the LSU folks individually so we can hash out some of their concerns and really educate us so we can go back and come up with design solutions that represent those different specific issues.
My name's Mike Wood. I'm with Wildlife and Fisheries. I know there were several references to the Cypress Tupelo swamp and the fact that the sailboats were hitting stumps and sedimentation, which I did really appreciate you guys talking about reducing that before it got into the lakes. However, over the decades, it has accreted to the point where it's a real problem, and the stumps are there. And so I'm asking, I guess, who on your team would have the expertise to address that, and have you given consideration to it, given that it was the major problem with the failure of the last renovation effort?
Yes, so I'll start and then I'll have Angela finish. But we know that the stumps are a real obstacle, obviously, and they're such an enormous issue. They're not simple to map because it's not 100 stumps we're talking about. We're talking about acres of stumps. And I've heard that some of them could be 15 feet in diameter. So I think that's why I've heard some of the solutions are draining parts of the lake or all of the lake and having a bulldozer come through to try to get them out of the way. I think there's still pitfalls with that solution. On projects I've worked on, we've more selectively dewatered portions of ponds and lakes using porta-dams to work in the dry in selective areas. I think part of our solution too is, one, understanding where the stumps are and how big they are, what elevation, but thinking about the use of the water and where we need deeper water. So maybe the sailboats have a certain part of the lake that is appropriate, that is free of stumps or could be freed of stumps. Other areas where it's perfectly okay to keep the stumps where we want shallower water and we're okay with some accumulation of sediment, or we're wanting the open water maybe to grow some vegetation. In terms of the different dredging techniques, I know GEC, of course, has looked at a number of different things between hydraulic dredging, bulldozing, clamshells, that kind of thing. HDR does have a number of folks, coastal experts, that I can let Angela talk about as well.
I know we do bring to the team technical experts, such as, like, we've got Neil McClellan, who is in our Houston office, used to work for Corps of Engineers in Galveston and was managing their dredging operations. So he's, I'm sure, dealt with a lot of issues along the Texas coast when he held that position, trying to come up with solutions for obstacles. We've also got coastal engineers in Lafayette, Jerry Howsky and Brett Giese, that have worked a lot with some of the federal agencies on restoration projects along the coast. And I know they've come up with very unique and innovative solutions on dealing with obstacles, whether it's an exploded ordnance or pipelines or abandoned facilities or debris that's come up, been washed up during storm events, and coming up with ways to get those out. So.
And I think the other thing I want to reinforce is that any dredging solution, we have to think about the impact during construction. If we're draining a portion of the lake, what's it look like, what's it smell like, the impact to wildlife. And we certainly have the expertise on on our team to handle that as well.
I'm Danny Mahaffey with LSU. We have 30,000 students right next door to the lake, a lot of faculty and staff. How will you get the LSU community involved in this project and get them excited about it?
So that is a good question, because how do you get that larger group involved? I think social media has done a good job to engage some folks, but I don't know if they actually have captured the students per se. and I think we can do some things more there. I think we would want to have some kind of on-campus forum as well. I also find that having some notices on the site itself for users, particularly the students who may be using their portion of the lake, although it's not necessarily your portion of the lake, because I know they run different circuits, the 4-mile loop or the 6-mile loop or whatever. But I think we want to use traditional methods of flyers and that kind of thing to, one, make people aware of some of these events we want to have. But then you have to think like a 19-year-old as well who's glued to their cell phone probably the whole time they're on campus, that's a way for us to capture them as well. Nothing replaces a forum like this where we can talk and people can hear each other's concerns. We've also used this kind of forum and then had it streamed live for people to follow, and that's been fairly successful as well, where people who cannot attend because they can't be there for whatever reason can chime in and comment, and then those comments can either be put on a screen live or they can be read to the group to say, so-and-so is kind of following along, and here's what their comment is. Sure.
Also, I mentioned earlier that I know that a lot of studies have been done, and depending on the issues that come up, if environmental issues come up, we could potentially have working groups that build on what's been done. I mean, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. I think engaging students and some of the faculty at the university in looking more closely at some of those specific issues that they've looked at already and taking their input into consideration would be another way to engage them a little bit more scientifically.
Brian Harmon, Public Works. You showed the plan that the Corps had, which showed some infill on the shorelines. They showed the islands. You made a comment that you were not maybe a proponent of that. You've also talked about 4 bays for collection of sedimentation. How do you propose to, I guess, handle all the dredge material that must be moved if, you know, your plan or what you're showing on Dalrymple was basically consistent with what the Corps said, but if you eliminate the hills, where's that material going?
Right. Well, it's a good question. And as I studied the Corps plans, they seem to be very black and white in terms of the options. You could hydraulically dredge and then shoot that off to a remote site and it goes into a pile off-site. Or you could bulldoze the spoil toward the edges and contain it in a way. But there were no hybrid solutions. So I felt like there needs to be some hybrid solutions because I'm not sure we want to necessarily handle 800,000 cubic yards and say we're going to put it all right here and then have mounds or some things that might not be appropriate. So I think we have to, and I think that was under the assumption that we were going to increase or remove sediment from all the lakes in general. I think we also have to question that premise and say there are some areas where maybe it's okay to have sediment. In other areas we want to keep clear. So that could then therefore reduce that volume of spoil that we would have to either create land with or cart off. And it also depends a lot about what that sediment is and if it's a appropriate growing media and how we use it structurally. You know, do we have to put it into geotextile sausage linings basically to create land? We did that on the golf course at City Park because a lot of times when it's this wet, how do you really handle it and make it actually bear any weight?
Dennis Blunt from BRAF. I wanted to ask sort of a 2-part question. I think you, Darrell in particular, spoke of the notion of pricing the project. Would your team, have folks that would be able to talk about sort of funding opportunities to make certain that you did have implementation after the planning process? And the second portion of that would be, have you given thoughts to the types of funding sources that would go into the project on the front end?
Right. So I can start that and I can see if anyone wants to add to that. But I know from my experience on the Emerald Necklace project that what we have found, because we're now in the implementation stage on that project, is that the rubber is hitting the road, and how do we pay for this? And we found kind of the successful thing, or the opportunity is to leverage, in the example of the Emerald Necklace project, which was about trees, is to look for transportation dollars and to improve a pathway and then also accomplish some of the goals for the trees. You relay that to the example of the lakes. We have multi-use paths here, which will be perfectly appropriate to go to DOT for federal highway dollars or state dollars for bike path improvements, enhancement money that would also be eligible for some of the landscape work. And I know talking to John yesterday, you all have done some brainstorming, and have a number of different potential funding sources. And I think you have to look at, of course, private money, like you all have already done with BRAF. But then in terms of public money, it could be transportation dollars, as I said. There could be ecological planning or restoration that we could tap into. I don't have the specifics of all those different funding sources yet. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
Just briefly, I mean, we're all aware of Restore Act and what's going on there, and there could be opportunities there. There's also other programs. NRCS has a program that could be applicable to this. We have folks that would help support the team in identifying those sources. I'm certainly not the expert in it. I know enough to be dangerous, but the sources are out there.
I want to come back to one of your opening comments where you talked about using natural instead of hard surfaces on some of these things, and you gave examples of bridges and separation of roads and pedestrians and those kind of things. I'm looking for a sense of place here, that when you come here, you see a beautiful lake. You actually look at it today and don't know it's in trouble in many cases. But it's also true that parts of Dalrymple and Stanford and others could be improved, as could some of the sharing of the roadways around the lakes with both motor vehicles and bike paths and pedestrians who are walking down the middle of the street. Would you give me an idea of what you really mean by natural solutions in terms of creating a sense of place so when you arrive there, you understand it's a special place, it's shared for multiple users, and how you would deal with those multiple users and separating from a safety standpoint, but also doing it in such a way that doesn't take away the character of the lakes?
Right. So I'll start with the examples of the natural solutions. So I can think of when I was near Stanford and East Lake Shore, there's some very steep banks there across the road from the private landowners. They're probably 1-to-1, if not steeper. And they all have packed broken concrete in there just to keep them from sloughing off. And I think it tends to be the wind direction is causing some wave action on that side, so that's probably precipitated that kind of solution. But I think there are ways to do that without concrete. I mentioned using the spoil to create land, and we can soften that slope to make it something that is appropriate for the wildlife that would be on those shorelines. Just in that same area, there's a log floating 50 feet offshore, there's 35 turtles on it, but there's very few instances of those habitat opportunities where actually we need to create these shallower banks and shelves of shallow water, one for the shallow shoreline birds, and actually have some snags, some dead trees and those kind of things as opportunities for the turtles and other wildlife that need that, as well as the fish that need shallow water and that kind of thing. Now, in terms of the separating of uses, that's where I think the spoil is a great advantage. Not everyone has this possibility to create land and give us a little more elbow room between the roads, either Stanford or Dalrymple Drive. And I think the idea there is to make sure that that transition in the extra space is done in a way that is consistent with the landform around here. And that's why when I looked at the core plans, I was a little concerned about creating mounds that are going to feel a little artificial or would be more like some of the Indian mounds you may see around. They're not necessarily something that seems indicative. So I don't know if you want to comment further on some of the natural things.
I'll just add, you can use different types of vegetation to help stabilize shorelines that are not only going to provide that stabilization without the hardscape, but are going to contribute aesthetically and support the wildlife. And depending on the types of vegetation you use, they actually can work with the system to help create a more sustainable area so that you're not dealing with having to dredge again as soon and not dealing with these water quality issues like you are now.
And I guess I just want to add one other thing. Some of it is not just the construction or the design, it's also the operation and maintenance afterwards, because I think there's too many edges of the lake now that are mow, blow, and go. put the lawnmower right to the lake edge or the weed whip. There's no native vegetation that supports the community of animals and wildlife that we really want. Just driving around the lakes yesterday, I found 2 areas where someone had sprayed herbicide in a broad way. There's just a brownout. So I think some of that is just education too. I mean, people need to understand the importance of the water and what's the right or wrong thing to do.
You responded to the RFP we wrote, which in some ways is restrictive to your imagination. So if you were going to come in here and do it and not be restricted, I wonder if your answers would be different, more broad, perhaps even visionary, beyond what you felt the scope allowed you to be. But specifically, you talk about 140 drains. You talk about what sounds like a master watershed study, which we didn't specifically ask for, but certainly has been implied in your comments, that if we don't take care of the inflow, we're going to be having this conversation just a few decades down the road again. And that's a much broader body of work when we look at both all of what you've talked about. Would you expand on that? And if you weren't restricted by RFP, is that where you'd start this project?
Well, I guess this is a case where I don't feel restricted by the RFP. The past 2 master plans that I used as examples, I actually, in the case of the Emerald Necklace, asked them to change the RFP for a particular reason. In this case, I think we will look at the watershed in a broad-brushed way, because in a master plan, I think that's appropriate. It's not going to be a detailed hydraulic analysis, but I think we can talk about the contributors to the watershed and ultimately the issues that are causing some problems with the lakes. I think also, I mean, it's also a good example of other larger issues, traffic. I mean, ultimately, in a master plan, we're going to look at existing traffic counts and past studies, but there are things that would require more detailed analysis to make changes to the traffic that may benefit the lakes. We're certainly going to identify some of those along the way and maybe even identify things that require further study.